The origin of jazz. Jazz came about through the marriage of African and European musical systems. It arose at the turn of the last century in the city of New Orleans and represents America's principal contribution to the arts. This lecture summarizes the musical and historical events that led to the emergence of jazz. Musicologist James Lincoln Collier recommends the first 4 bars of King Oliver's cornet solo in the song Dippermouth Blues as a good starting point for an investigation into jazz history. Collier argues that these 4 bars contain all the information needed to understand what jazz is all about. Oliver's solo in the song has the following jazzy characteristics. It has an unusual, slightly shrill but highly personalized tone quality. It discards the Western conventions of major and minor scales in favor of the blues scale, and it displays a high degree of syncopation. Let's take a listen to this solo. Not only is the ground rhythm of this song highly syncopated, but Oliver's solo is even more syncopated than the song itself. Indeed, his cornet part is wholly detached from the song's rhythm. It is like the song and the solo are travelers who have taken contrasting but roughly parallel routes through the countryside, only to arrive at the same destination at the same time. In a way, Oliver's solo was like graffiti, because it's a highly personalized artistic expression that can exist upon any backdrop. To me, this is the most essential attribute of jazz. Let's take a look at how jazz got this peculiar character. Inheritance. Jazz is a product of African and European traditions. African traditions inform jazz's rhythm and its social structures. European traditions inform jazz's instrumentation and its harmonic structures. As Dippermouth Blues illustrates, jazz often has more than one rhythm happening at the same time. African drumming is like this too. Both jazz and African drumming are said to be polyrhythmic, which means they exhibit simultaneous, uncongruent drum beats. To the listener, music of this sort sounds like it's being continuously displaced by overlapping rhythms. Jazz is often like this. Let's take a quick listen to drumming of this sort. As far as its social structure goes, jazz is meant to be performed in front of a participatory audience. That is, one that is dancing, singing, and clapping along with the performance. Music in the African tradition is often of the call and response variety, and so is participatory by design. Jazz inherited this design. In the European tradition, there is a clear demarcation point between audience and performer. It's true that folk dancing and folk singing exist in European traditions, but these activities are nowhere near as ubiquitous or as well ascribed to as they are in Africa. European traditions did, however, give jazz its instruments. The trumpet, piano, clarinet, guitar, saxophone, and most other jazz instruments evolved in Europe. European traditions also gave jazz its harmonic conventions. Nearly all jazz music is based on chord progressions. Chord progressions are sequential note clusters designed to support melody. This is one such chord progression played on guitar. And here it is again, this time supporting a melody. There are no chord progressions in traditional African music, but traditional European music is full of them. Since jazz was invented by Black Americans playing European instruments, the African heritage is of particular interest and deserves special scrutiny. The African heritage. In Africa, Music is interwoven into every facet of daily life. There are rituals and accompanying songs for the mundane and the profound, songs for pulling in the fishing nets, songs for puberty rites, songs for funerals, songs for warriors, songs for hoeing the fields, etc. In fact, speech itself is inflected with pitch in a way that Western languages are not. The same word in African languages can be spoken differently, that is, sung differently, to change the meaning. Consider the possible variants of the pronunciation of the West African word ogun. It has more than 20 meanings. Say it one way and it means medicine, say it another way and it means god of iron, still another and it means property. All the different meanings are determined by the word's pitch inflection. Ogun, ogun, etc. Another feature of West African language is the tradition of dramatic storytelling. Storytellers will often drift from sung words into spoken words, kind of like the dramaturgical delivery of Martin Luther King Jr.
Will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
This manner of storytelling is rather like a recitative in an opera, a sort of speech song designed to get the dialogue across. African languages, because of their pitched nature, can be transmitted long distances via the talking drum. A talking drum is shaped somewhat like an hourglass and possesses chords affixed to the drum head, allowing players to perturb the tension and change the drum's pitch. When the drum is played with a mallet, it can be used to create sounds approximating human speech. A birth announcement made with the talking drum may carry on as follows. Batoka, fala, fala, tokima, bola, bola, basiki, waliane, imaki, tongo, ganda, ali, nade, bobila, wapole, boli, asaka, lasika, koki, koki. This is the translation. The mats are rolled up, we feel strong. A woman came from the forest, she is in the open village. That is enough for this time. That's a pretty complex message considering the Western version of long-distance communication, such as fire towers and bugle calls, could really only get digital messages across. Yes, no, attack, hold your position, etc. Not all Africans play drums, but nearly all sing. Most African singing is highly rhythmic and exists in the call and response format. Okay, I'll try some call and response here. Give flesh to the hyenas at daybreak. Oh, the broad spears. The spear of the Sultan is the broadest. Oh, the broad spears. It's almost as if the repeated refrain, "Oh, the broad spears," is acting as a percussion motif or as a drum part. The pitch set, or scale from which African songs of this sort are derived, is called the pentatonic scale. It is comprised of 5 notes, like its name suggests. C, D, E, G, A, C. These notes are great for making simple melodies. Every culture on Earth uses the pentatonic scale. It is very similar to the Western diatonic scale, also known as the major scale. More remarkable than the pitch set used by the African singers is the manner in which he or she distorts and exaggerates timbre. Timbre refers to tone quality. Consider that bass guitars and tubas can play the same notes, but we, as the listeners, can tell which one's which even with our eyes closed. This is because the tuba and the bass guitar initiate and sustain their notes differently, thus producing different timbres. Tuba you blow through a pipe into a mouthpiece, and a bass guitar you pluck a string. An African singer's pitch delivery will often fall off at the end of a phrase and usually features slurring between notes. Because the general concept of pitch is much less defined in these traditions, the music delivered with this approach may sound out of tune to our Western ears. Another oddity is that African singing technique often uses guttural, back-of-the-throat growling sounds mixed with shouting. Techniques such as these create timbres designed to stand out. Classically trained musicians in the Western tradition strive for an idealized and perfected tone. This approach creates the exquisitely balanced timbres of a symphony orchestra. There is nothing like this sort of balance and homogeneity in African musical traditions. Instead, each voice is meant to be an individual. As mentioned above, most African music is polyrhythmic. That is, most of the music features a complex interplay between multiple overlapping rhythms. The trained Western musician understands polyrhythms such as these as 3 against 2 or as 4 against 3. Okay, I'll play two notes, a low one and a high one. The low one I'll divide into 2, and the high one I'll divide into 3. Let's try it out. There's the low one. And here's the high one. All right, polyrhythm. The African version of these polyrhythms often takes the form of repeated phrases that sometimes overlap and sometimes contrast other repeated phrases happening at the same time. In fact, the phraseology of African polyrhythms may overlap differently every time, or it may not overlap at all. It's as if each rhythm exists within a separate but simultaneous song. This is just like Joe Oliver's lead break in Dippermouth Blues. The results of this approach are complex, often bewildering rhythmic textures. As it happened, these rhythms were imported to America along with the Africans. An American tradition. Jazz represents a curious mix of style and form that could only have evolved in America and could only have been created by Black Americans. The transformation of African music traditions into African American music traditions occurred principally through the vehicle of the work song. The work song has almost no analog in European traditions. A sea shanty is a sort of work song, but it is the exception, not the rule. European Americans, by and large, carried on with their work without musical accompaniment. So singing while working, though unusual to the whites, was not discouraged because there was no white tradition in place in which work singing could interfere. Closely related to work songs are the field hollers, which were shouts and moans issued forth while working alone in the fields, possibly a form of communication with other slaves in distant fields. The work songs and field hollers sung by the slaves were not necessarily related to the task at hand. Often the songs were used to express discontent and anger. The rhythm of the work songs usually dictated the movement of the work songs, shucking corn, hoeing fields, rowing boats, etc. During American colonialism, many blacks adopted Christianity. Some, at least in the North, participated in white church services and learned how to sing some of the songs from the hymnal. By the beginning of the 19th century, blacks had begun to develop their own Christian congregations. They also began to develop their own repertoire of religious music, including a form of hymn known as a spiritual. Spirituals were highly influenced by, and very similar to, work songs. Like the work songs, the spirituals were equally dedicated to the call and response format. Within these black religious gatherings, a curious ritual evolved known as the ring shout. During the ring shout, blacks would whip themselves into a religious ecstasy while shuffling and dancing about in a circle, often while clapping hands and singing spirituals. Some musicologists suggest that the music sung during the ring shouts was highly influential to later black musical forms such as the blues. Blues is probably the most consequential of jazz's forebearers. That is, it exerted the greatest influence on the development of the jazz style. Despite being singled out for special scrutiny, blues is not too different from other African American folk traditions on offer. In fact, one could say that blues is consubstantial with the work songs, field hollers, and spirituals it evolved from. This is to say, blues is comprised of the same musical substances as these other forms. Blues uses call and response, blues uses unusual pitch sets, and blues uses guttural, ragged timbres, etc. Out of all its neighboring styles, blues has the most in common with the work song. African Americans would often sing songs during leisure time that were stylistically similar to the work songs. These new songs would have the same slow tempos, the same paired verses. Sing a line, answer it with the refrain. Sing another line, answer it again with the refrain, etc. And the same ragged sliding timbres. Moreover, since the song was sung away from the work environment, the subject matter could be more self-reflective and personalized. Often the blues songs were about sex or about discontent. It's thought that blues emerged as its own format sometime about 1880 and continued to evolve over the next generation. It arrived in its recognizable form sometime about 1910. The historical record is absent of any mention of the blues until approximately this time. The first and most primitive form of the blues is known as country blues. Blind Lemon Jefferson, popular in the 1920s, so about 40 years from where we are in the timeline, represents the prototypical country bluesman. He played guitar and sang the blues. Let's take a quick listen to Blind Lemon Jefferson.
Well, it's straight and night, strikes all out of line. Well, it's straight and night, strikes all out of line.
The guitar's availability and affordability increased at the end of the 19th century, and so it was a practical choice to accompany the new blues form. Reflecting a desire by the bluesmen to emulate ragged vocal timbres, the guitars were sometimes played with the edge of a knife or with a bottleneck. Something like this. In the strictest sense, blues is a format of black dialect poetry sung to vocal formulas. The principal formula being A-A-B. Here's a typical example from Blind Lemon Jefferson's song Rambler Blues. Well, it's train time now, and the track's all out of line. Well, it's train time now, and track's all out of line. And I come here soon, I want to catch that number 9. Most unusual about the blues is its modal ambiguity. Most of the world's music exists in one of two primary modes, the major scale or the minor scale. Blues, on the other hand, exists right between these two modes. Much like the aforementioned African songs. The third of the scale, the part of the scale determinate of mode, is obscured. The blues scale is neither major nor minor. It's somewhere in between because it's got a major third and a minor third. Then it just plays both. And it's ambiguous. Another style to influence jazz is ragtime. Ascendant in the last decade of the 19th century, ragtime was an upbeat and jangly piano music, similar in style to the march of a brass band. Ragtime's hallmark is heavy, near-ubiquitous syncopation. Ragtime features the 3/2 feel that is so common in West African music. In ragtime, the 3 beat groupings are uneven parts, however, usually with the middle beat being twice as long as the other 2, etc. The groupings of 2, which were more or less even in ragtime, was usually occupied by the ground bass of the pianist's left hand. In the parlance of their time, playing this sort of mixed rhythm was known as ragging the beat or as playing ragged, hence the name ragtime. Scott Joplin is the most famous exponent of this style. Listen for the ragged rhythms of his famous Maple Leaf Rag. The last antecedent of jazz to be covered here is a European tradition, namely that of the brass band. The principal components of a typical turn-of-the-last-century brass band were cornet, trombone, tuba, and other brass instruments, plus percussion. Brass band music sits squarely in the Western tradition of harmony, melody, and rhythm. Brass band music was very popular in the U.S. during the 19th century. Many small towns and hamlets had their own bandstands and community bands proudly playing the popular marches of the day. One such march, John Philip Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever, features all the essential attributes of the style: upbeat melodies, energetic drumming, and thick brass harmonies. The end of the Spanish-American War in 1898 resulted in many leftover military band instruments turning up in southern pawnshops and thrift stores. This allowed blacks in these areas easy access to the popular band instruments. By the turn of the 20th century, all of jazz's conspirators were in place: African American folk traditions, ragtime, and brass bands. Just one more step was required: a shift in rhythm. Jazz detonates. Historians have converged on New Orleans as the true birthplace of jazz. It's here that a subculture within a subculture existed: the Black Creole. The Creoles of color, offspring of wealthy French and Spanish men and slave women, were often trained in the European traditions of music. Then, when Jim Crow laws of the 19th century deemed the Creoles to be blacks and not whites, and thus subject to segregation, they were forced to intermingle and work with the African blacks. The Creoles of color, therefore, absorbed the cultural traditions of blues and ragtime and superimposed their own inherited European traditions onto these styles, namely their skillful instrumentation and knowledge of harmony. The musical synergy between the Creoles and the blacks is what turned ragtime into jazz. The critical step was having their rhythm sections play 4 beats for each musical bar or measure instead of the usual 2. This is sometimes referred to as the Big Four. Okay, so you take a typical march, like When the Saints Go Marching In. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Etc. Jazz puts it in 4. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Another critical step in the birth of jazz was playing the blues on brass instruments. Until this time, blues had principally been a vocal form, melodically speaking. That is, the singer handled the blues inflections, the shouts, the growls, the pitch bends, etc. We will never know who was first to do this, but we do know of an early exponent, cornetist Buddy Bolden. Some musicologists do, in fact, credit him and his group with the invention of jazz. But facts of the matter are cloaked in historical darkness. Mythology and apocryphal stories are all we really have about Bolden. In any case, Bolden is thought to have played a brass band version of ragtime that used blues conventions like improvisation, ambiguous modality, and gruff timbres. This is thought to have happened around the year 1900 in the city of New Orleans. There are no known recordings of Bolden or his band, but the cornet solo by Joe Oliver at the top of this article is probably pretty close. Allegedly, there was a phonographic cylinder recorded in the 1890s possessing 3 Bolden tracks. If this recording actually existed, it was probably made for private music dealers and not widely distributed. If found, it would be the holy grail of jazz artifacts.